Madam Board Chair, I'm tempted to address you as my former counterpart, because we had a time when I was chairing the Scotland Malawi partnership, and Dr. Boya was chairing Malawi Scotland, but she has lasted longer than me. You can see she's a strong leader. And distinguished board members, and much appreciation of all your hard work in leading the organization, and the staff team, Madam Stella, Madam Linda, I think Juana and Patso, wherever he is, really appreciating your day-to-day work. And also I recognize all the members. This is a member-led organization. So I want to begin with appreciating all the members who have gathered together today. So it's a great thrill for me to be here today at this AGM and symposium being held 150 years after the death of David Livingstone, to take the next step in the journey that he started. I remember in 2013, when we were marking the 200th anniversary of Livingstone's birth, Bishop James Tenga Tenga was invited to speak at the celebration in Edinburgh. And he startled the audience there when he started off by claiming that David Livingstone is his ancestor. Now, the audience looked very puzzled when he said this. They thought, did Livingstone have children in Africa that we did not know about? But of course, the African understanding of the ancestors is much bigger than the literalistic Western one. What Bishop Tenga Tenga was talking about is that Livingstone had become his ancestor by the power of the life that he lived and the inspiration that he continues to provide. And this is true not only for Tenga Tenga as an individual, but for all Malawians who identify with Livingstone and his legacy. So this brings us to this year, when we are remembering the 150th anniversary of the death of David Livingstone at Chitambo's village. To remember someone's death is to remember an ancestor. And Livingstone is an ancestor not only of his original Scottish people, but also of the Africans who became his people, the people for whom he lived and among whom he died. So, why do we remember this unusual Scot who liked to go on long walks across Africa? One reason I would suggest is the quality of friendship that marked his interactions. Now, it is true that his relations with his fellow Europeans were often stormy and sometimes broke down completely. But in the African setting, he formed friendships that were deep and enduring. Donald Fraser of Mbangweni noticed that wherever Livingstone had been, there were people who remembered him with love and affection. So that later on, when the Livingstonia missionaries arrived, they only had to explain that they were Livingstone's people to be sure of a warm welcome. Now, an important thing here is that there are always two sides to a friendship. So we should remember that the Malawian chiefs and people who received Livingstone played just as great a part as he did in the origins of this relationship that we're celebrating today. Had they been hostile or unfriendly, we would not be remembering the coming of David Livingstone in the way we are doing today. But the fact of history is that the Malawian communities of that time struck up a relationship with David Livingstone that has proved to be influential, even far beyond what they could have imagined at the time. The spirit of friendship that Livingstone brought was informed by something he was against and something of which he was in favor. What he was against, to put it quite frankly, was racism. He had started off as a missionary in South Africa, but he was appalled by the racial attitudes that he found there, the attitudes on which the apartheid system would later be built were already present. So part of the reason that he ended up in Malawi is that he wanted to get as far away as possible from the racist attitudes that he found in South Africa. The flip side of this is that he was passionately in favor of inclusion and social justice. For Livingstone, this was an outworking of his Christian faith and belief in common humanity. For him, this meant that he could not rest until he had found a way to eradicate the slave trade that was ravaging this part of Africa in his time. The reason he was fighting the slave trade is that he believed in human dignity. He could never accept that a human being could be deprived of their freedom and sold as a commodity. He could never accept the racism that allowed for some people to be treated like this simply because of the color of their skin. So he fought against the slave trade with every fiber of his being. He could say, I have never met an African who did not know whose side I am on. He accomplished a lot in his lifetime, but he possibly accomplished even more by his death. For the effect of his death was to bring together the people of Malawi and the people of Scotland in a remarkable way. The effect of his death in Scotland was to rouse a determination that his work in Africa must not be allowed to die with him. So 2 years later, Robert Laws and the first Livingstonia party arrived at Cape Maclear to carry on what Livingstone had begun. And when they arrived, and their Malawian hosts realized that these were the friends of Dr. Livingstone, they were warmly welcomed. And since that moment, in 1875, I don't think there has been a single day when Malawians and Scots have not been together somewhere or other, talking, planning, taking action, building hope. We have been on a long journey together, and it's surely good to have a companion when you're on a long road. But it has not been an easy journey. All the way along, it has been a battle. When Livingstone was here, he came as a fighter. Kenneth Kaunda called him Africa's first freedom fighter. The fight for him, of course, was against the slave trade, which was a curse on the land of Malawi during his time. Thank God, through his inspiration, the slave trade was eventually eradicated in Malawi, at least in the crude form that it took in the 19th century. But did this mean that the fight for human dignity was over? No, it was not. For what soon followed was the imposition of British colonial rule and another assault on the dignity and freedom of Malawi's people. This is where our Malawi-Scotland story gets a bit complicated. During the time of the British Empire, Scotland itself was colonized to quite some extent, but it was also fully part of the colonizing power. Here in Malawi, the European estate with the worst conditions for African workers was the Magomero estate of Alexander Livingston Bruce, who was the grandson of David Livingstone. This was where, in 1915, John Chilembwe decided that he had to stand up and resist what was happening by force of arms. Unfortunately, we have to recognize that Scots, among others, were involved in committing the oppression and abuse that came with the system of colonial rule. But they could also be found on the other side, even at the height of the colonial period. David Clement Scott and Alexander Heatherwick at Blantyre Mission always stood against such abuses. Our contention, they wrote, is that if the Europeans take the land, they practically enslave the native population. There is no law to help the native in his distress, but there is power put into the Europeans' hands to force the native to work. During his 45 years at Blantyre, Alexander Heatherwick was nearly always in a fight. And most of the time, it was a fight to defend Malawian communities from the excesses of colonial rule. Land, labor, and taxation became critical issues at that time. Scott and Heatherwick made themselves very unpopular with the colonial administration by their constant criticism of government policy on these issues. But they knew that they were voicing the concerns of their Malawian friends, and there was no way they were going to keep quiet. Malawians and Scots were together in the struggle for justice even then. The next big battle we had to fight came after Heatherwick's time. This was when the Federation of Rhodesia and Nyasaland was imposed on Malawi in 1953 against the wishes of practically the entire African population. Malawians understood correctly that to be ruled by a white settler regime in Salisbury would entrench a permanent system of racist discrimination and economic exploitation. The only white people who understood their point were the Scots, and huge meetings were held in Scotland in 1953 to protest against the imposition of the Federation. All in vain, unfortunately. Before long, as you know, Malawians regrouped and began the movement to get out of the Federation and to gain independence. This led to the state of emergency in 1959 and the biggest political crisis in Malawi's history. Once again, it was Scots who stood with Malawians in their struggle. When the Church of Scotland General Assembly met in 1959, it passed a resolution that the time has passed for working with nicely balanced arrangements relating the colonial government, the European inhabitants, and the African population. The time has come, they said, for a daring and creative transfer of power to the African people. It was a clear call for Malawi's independence. 4 cabinet ministers from the British government were present to witness that assembly debate. And this was the moment that they realized that the federation was finished and they had to prepare for Malawi to become an independent nation. This was not forgotten in 1992 when Malawians had another battle on their hands. This time, system, when the Church of Scotland General Assembly again took its stand with Malawians in their struggle for freedom. I remember that a telegram arrived from Harry Bwanausi to say that the moral authority of the Church of Scotland will now emancipate us for the second time. It was overstating the case. The Italians and Scots stood together in the heat of the crisis. We have been through many battles together, but I have to tell you that the fighting is not finished yet. The human dignity for which Livingstone was fighting, the human dignity that was at stake in the colonial period, under the Federation, and in the one-party era, this precious human dignity still needs people who will fight for it today. When Malawi's Catholic bishops wrote their famous pastoral letter of 1992, they stated, talking about Malawi, of course, that many people still live in circumstances which are hardly compatible with their dignity as sons and daughters of God. Their life is a struggle for survival. At the same time, a minority enjoys the fruits of development and can afford a life of luxury and wealth. We appeal for a more just and equal distribution of the nation's wealth. This is an appeal that today still needs to be made at a national level, but it also needs to be made at a global level. For we have a global economic system in place that is systematically channeling resources to the wealthy and powerful while further depriving those with the least resources. Once upon a time, the slave trade brought great wealth to some while depriving many of their life and liberty. Today, we see the same dynamic playing out in a different way. We need to say no, and we need to be active in working for a more just and equitable global economy. This will not be easy. Powerful forces are ranged against us. We will need the same courage that David Livingstone had. We will need the same commitment to the cause of human dignity. And we will need the solidarity that will enable us to stand shoulder to shoulder in this great battle of our time. And another battle is in front of us, and this might be our biggest one. It is the battle for the climate. For those of us who were in southern Malawi when Cyclone Freddy struck in March of this year, we do not need any convincing that the climate crisis is a real and present danger to our life and livelihood. The situation is so serious that no one among us by themselves can do enough to make any difference. Our only hope is to act together. This is where Malawi and Scotland have something to bring to the table. Since we have traveled so far together, and since we've fought side by side in so many battles, we have a solidarity that we can bring to the life or death struggle that is in front of us right now. What would David Livingstone think if he were able to come and be among us in this meeting today? I think he would be delighted to see that the friendship between Malawians and Scots is still there, and that in fact there are more people involved in it today than ever before. But I think he would want to ask us a question. Are we together in the fight? Are we fighting for justice in today's world? Are we fighting for inclusion, for a world that gives a fair chance to all? Are we fighting for our shared humanity against all that threatens it? Are we fighting for our precious planet against all that imperils it? Great that we are together in friendship today, but let's also be together in the fight for the things that matter most. Then we will honor the ancestor whose life and death we remember today. Madam Chair, thank you for your attention.